Hello, everyone. Just so you know who I am, because I've forgotten to say this multiple times, my name is Jill Winburn, and I am the director of Francis Fukre Gallery. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. Thanks for coming and supporting the gallery and also the Expressive Arts Artist in Residence program. But before I introduce tonight's artist, I would like to thank my gallery assistants, Andrew and Gilbert, for helping, because your help is just so greatly appreciated. I just want you to know that, and you're awesome. Yay. Okay, so Claire Fall Blanchette is an artist working across multiple disciplines, including sculpture, printmaking, and drawing. Using organic and unconventional materials, she investigates the boundaries that humans have established between the built world and the environment. Claire holds an MFA in studio art from the University of Arizona and a BFA in printmaking and history of art from Massachusetts College of Art and Design in Boston. And here she is.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Jill, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm excited to talk more about my work with you all. My practice comes out of a desire to understand my participation in systems that lead to environmental destruction. And it's through this lens that I investigate how human and non-human partnerships can offer alternative futures that bend away from the anthropocentric perspective. I work with mycelium, which is the root system of a fungus, fungal spores, kombucha scoby, and other found natural items to create sculptures, drawings, and prints. Through my methodologies and my materials, I'm examining organic processes for guidance in fostering a mutually beneficial world. My upbringing had a big influence on why I'm working this way and how I think about my artistic practice. I grew up in a small town in Maine. These are images from my childhood home, and it was a very rural place to spend my childhood, and I spent a lot of time outdoors and consistently had access to natural spaces. I spent a lot of time also on the coast of Maine and backpacking and camping in the mountains. And these landscapes aren't directly referenced in my work, but my relationship with them and the way they inform my relationship with other places has become really apparent to me as I've developed my practice over the last couple of years. Having access to these environments made me more observant and curious about the world and how it all fits together, and that really shaped the way that I focus my ideas and projects in the studio. The love and care for the environments of my childhood carried into more unfamiliar places as I left Maine. And I think if you spend time in similar remote or rural places, you're really intimately familiar with spaces like this. It becomes really clear when things are quickly changing due to climate change. And this comes with a lot of grief and anger about that and the inaction that comes along with it. But this knowledge really pushes me towards the work that I'm doing in my studio now, looking at non-human organisms to be a guide as we look for ways to move forward into the future with more sustainable and symbiotic ways. And I want to talk about some of my recent projects that led to the work that I've done here in Silver City. All of this work was created while I was a graduate student at the University of Arizona from 2022 to 2025. This work is titled Ruins, and it's a piece that's permanently installed at the Land with No Name, which is an outdoor sculpture sanctuary outside of Tucson. And Ruins is a sculpture created in collaboration with mycelial networks, which is, again, the root system of a fungus. Mycelia hyphae form tight webs that bind materials together as the enzymes they secrete start to decompose the substrate they live within. Using this natural process, living material is grown into standardized block forms and then removed when it suited the needs of the project. However, the mycelium behaved in really unexpected ways. It continued to thrive even after I'd removed the bricks to dry. developing striking colors across the surfaces and even sprouting, fruiting mushrooms. These developments, to me, were largely unpredictable and uncontrollable. Here's an image of mycelium growing throughout a substrate. It will grow and continue to develop until it's absorbed all of the food it can from any given food source. This is an earlier installation of the same project installed in the courtyard of the Environmental Natural Resource Building on the University of Arizona campus. And through both the process of growing and its final form, ruins exhibits the interactions between human and non-human entities. The sculpture echoes the remains of human-built structures. However, the bricks themselves are created through a highly complex natural process. And as I continued to work and learn about and with this material, I became focused on the mycelium's own processes and strategies for survival. As one member in a greater ecosystem, mycelium holds soils together, forms symbiotic relationships with plants, and accelerates decay to make space for new life. In contrast to humans, who have created stark separations between ourselves and the natural world, mycelium evolved reciprocal relationships with other organisms that increase their collective chance of survival. So Ruins is now installed permanently at the Landwood Domain, and living outdoors, the sculpture will continue to evolve. Colors will shift as it weathers in the sun and rain and wind, and it will invite both new growth and decay as the material begins to decompose. And as I was working on this project, I ended up letting 4 of the bricks continue growing, and I built them these vitrines to live in. And these are images from an exhibition at the University of Arizona where I let these blocks grow throughout the course of the gallery show. And Ruins was the first time I'd worked with mycelium on such a large scale. And it was really fascinating to develop this relationship with another organism where I'm attempting some sort of restraint on the organism, and the mycelium is reacting to that. In this case, the vitrines were constantly breaking open at the edges as the mushrooms kind of pushed against the plexiglass. And at some points, I'd have to go to the gallery every day to fix them, but a lot of the times, like more than once a week. And this push and pull between myself and the mycelium became a way to understand the complexities of human authority over the environment, where I was kind of playing this out on a smaller scale with these bricks in the gallery. I also want to be clear that I'm not a scientist. I don't have a science background. And so I approach all of this work through an artistic lens rather than using a more traditional scientific method. While I'm working, I often act intuitively, reacting to whatever happened before, and producing new methods as I work. I'm still asking myself lots and lots of questions and attempting different experiments based on previous results, but I often don't know exactly why anything is happening or why something's behaving in the way that it is. I'm only kind of taking my best guess and then changing my methods based on that. So while I was working with the mycelium, I was also developing another body of work using buffalo grass, which is an invasive grass in Arizona. This installation is titled Alien New Wilds, and it uses the invasive plant to envision new relationships with the natural world where unseen networks are revealed. And I was interested in looking at how invasive species are vilified as opportunistic organisms that outcompete native plants. But ultimately, these human-built systems that exploit the land are often to blame for the presence of these species in our landscapes. Buffalo grass, for instance, was introduced as both cattle feed and erosion control in Arizona in the 1950s. The grass does a lot of harm in the Sonoran Desert. It increases wildfire risk in areas that are not fire resistant, and then it's able to regrow faster than slow-growing native plants. But through this installation, I was considering how we might reframe the issue of invasives and reveal the human hand within the spread of these species, rather than simply making the grass the enemy, but looking at how and why they end up where they do. And I included a lot of different materials and parts of the buffalo grass plant in this work, So I used the root ball from the plant for these kind of like larger forms, which I harvested from a friend's yard. And I also made paper pulp with the buffalo grass stalks and then sculpted these into these tendrils that you can see here on the left image. And entangled with all of these natural materials, I included a fluorescent mesoline, which is used in construction. So through the manipulation of both the organic and synthetic, this piece twists the human and the natural together to examine our interconnectedness within the never-ending cycle of exploitation, introduction, and then attempted eradication of these alien species. And then the last project I want to talk about is my MFA thesis, which is titled Tangled Currents. This project uses 8 historic landfills along the Santa Cruz River in Tucson as a framework to examine the sustained consequences of human activity on a local ecosystem. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the city of Tucson operated landfills directly alongside the Santa Cruz. These are filled in or built over now, but they're hidden reminders of this human impact on the environment. And some of these sites are even threatening to upend efforts to revitalize the Santa Cruz and reintroduce water to the river for fear of contamination. Each of these sculptures represents a separate landfill, and the forms are scaled to represent the shape and depth of each respective site. So these sculptures are made from reishi mycelium, which is the mushroom that I'm mostly using in my practice. Reishi fungal networks can clean toxins from soil and water through a process called mycoremediation. And their use in this project offers a speculative solution for the remediation of these landfill sites. To create the sculptures, a mixture of reishi mycelium, hardwood shavings, and hemp hurd are packed into these cardboard molds. And the reishi mycelium is wood loving, so it will consume anything that's wood-based like paper or cardboard. So as it grew, it also consumed the cardboard, adding to kind of this geological strata of the structures. 8 drawings also accompany the sculptures and pull from various sources relating to the monitoring of these sites, which include maps, contamination prediction models, and scientific diagrams. Layered within these are hand-drawn interpretations of the microscopic mycelial systems painted with spores that I collected off of the sculptures after they were done growing. The abstracted marks oscillate between the micro and the macro to encompass the complexities of human and non-human relationships, creating an opportunity to reflect on our implicit participation in both spaces. Through these drawings, I was really interested in examining how both the topographical and the microscopic can feel like hidden or unseen spaces, and you're not necessarily encountering them on a daily basis. And I wanted to explore how these spaces could layer together and be intertwined. And so throughout this project, I was really interested in presenting human and non-human partnerships as a way towards more sustainable and symbiotic futures, suggesting that the mycelium could offer alternatives to human-centered ways of thinking by looking at its natural and inherent processes and developing more mutual beneficial worlds. And now I want to switch gears and talk about the work I've been making here in Silver City. Coming out of graduate school and into residency here at WNMU has been such an amazing experience. To have the time to examine and be placed within the context of the practice that I've been developing over the past few years has been really incredible. The title of the exhibition in McRae is Ground Truthing, which comes from an essay by Barry Lopez included in his book, Embrace Fearlessly, The Burning World. In this essay, he encounters a Bureau of Land Management geologist surveying a remote area of the Mojave Desert. And the geologist tells Lopez that what he's doing there is ground truthing. And ground truthing is the process of validating remote sensing data, such as satellite imagery, through direct field observation. It contrasts the rendering of an object with the object itself. For Lopez and for me as well, ground truthing raises a lot of questions about how we can understand a place and where we are in the world. So how can we render ourselves within a landscape and how can we really understand that place in a very complex and interesting world. And when I first arrived in Silver City, I spent a lot of time physically exploring the area and walking and observing as I got to know the space. And I'm often taking these images of my shadow, and I don't just do it here. And I find them kind of funny, but for me, that it does also connect to this idea behind ground truthing, where I'm capturing my projection, the projection of my form within an environment, using the environment itself. And they're also a record for me of my presence within a place as I'm working to understand it and observing within it. So I spend a lot of time researching digitally and physically. And this practice of direct observation coupled with more traditional modes of research is really important to my practice, especially when I'm in a new place. Here in Silver City, I was really focused on this intersection between industry and environmental conservation. And throughout my practice, I'm also thinking about the geography that shapes a particular location, and that's really reflected within this research here on the screen. There's a lot of satellite photos and diagrams of how this region formed geologically. But I'm really interested in geographer Yi Fu Tuan's idea that we assign and derive meaning from the world's geography, and then organize the world around ourselves so the geography influences our sense of place. Throughout the work that I produced during my residency and for the exhibition, organic materials intertwined with remnants of human impact, tracing intersections of time, industrial extraction, and biological repair. And there are 4 bodies of work that make up the exhibition, so I'm going to talk about each of them and the ideas behind them. So as I said, I spent a lot of time physically and digitally researching when I first arrived here, but I also started off, as I often do in my practice, by making drawings. So on the left is one of the series of 5 drawings included in the exhibition that came out of my research into the Gila River and the greater watershed of New Mexico. And I was thinking a lot about the threat to these ecosystems from a variety of sources, and the importance that riparian ecosystems hold in maintaining balance within the environment. And as I researched the Gila and Nimbus rivers, I came across this GIS riparian habitat map that is developed by the University of New Mexico. I was really intrigued visually by this, the kind of fluorescent colors on this satellite image. And the map includes the river, but also the riparian areas that surround the river. This also includes human habitats like agricultural land or development. And I found this expansion of the river bank really fascinating, alluding to this greater impact that the river has as it flows through any given environment. And so I started making these drawings based on the riparian habitat maps. And these are 2 details of 2 of the drawings that are included in the exhibition. And through these little meticulous meditative marks, I was reflecting on both the rendering and the dissolving of these waterways and the surrounding ecosystems. So the marks hold multiple meanings. They could be the flow of nutrients, the infiltration of contaminants, or the evaporation of these systems altogether. And I really enjoyed kind of playing with how I was thinking of these marks as I was making this series of drawings. But I was also thinking a lot about the Gila specifically, and its status as the last free-flowing river in New Mexico. At the time, I was also interested in exploring how I might incorporate other bio-based or living materials into my art practice. And so I was interested in how I could maybe combine those 2 interests. And I experimented with growing kombucha stogie, which is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast that forms on top of a fermenting kombucha tea, but I never actually created anything with the material. So pictured on the left is a grown and living kombucha stogie before I dried it out. And the liquid is green because I used kombucha with spirulina in it, and it started to also grow algae. But it didn't affect the kombucha stogie at all. And so as you dry the stogie, it loses all its moisture, and it turns into this kind of skin-like parchment leathery material. So on the right are two of the dried kombucha scobies that have been laser cut as my first test using a laser cutter with this material. And I was interested in how I could layer and manipulate the luminosity of the SCOBY with the laser cutter and get these really kind of intricate and delicate marks. But as I said, I was really interested in how these kombucha SCOBYs might relate to the Gila, and I started growing them using water that I've been collecting from the Gila and brewed into a tea. And I was interested how these kind of microbial environments might interact and if I would even see anything, which turns out I didn't, but it was interesting to use that as a material in itself. But SCOBY is a protective layer. It's also often called the mother because it's both formed from and facilitates the fermentation process of the kombucha. The SCOBY acts as a barrier that protects the tea from any contaminants in the air and allows the symbiotic bacteria and yeast colonies to flourish. So I was thinking about combining this inherently protective material with images of vulnerable areas along the Gila River. Specifically, I was looking at areas that were once threatened by dam or reservoir projects. So I started researching these areas near the confluence with Turkey Creek and the communities of Gila and Cliff. And I started looking at GIS topographical maps and collecting kind of different viewpoints of these areas from different heights. And so on the left, that's a little bit higher up, and then on the right, you're zoomed in and actually kind of looking at what exists underneath the water. And I also started looking for documents detailing potential reservoirs or channels that they were planning for these areas, and then turning those into files that I could cut on the laser cutter. But all this was really bird's eye view, topographical, and felt really far-reaching. And I was curious about what actually existed there now on the ground. So I collected soil samples from areas along the Gila, and I was able to connect with Carol Ann at the Upper Gila Watershed Alliance and look at these samples under a microscope, which was so exciting and really fun. Kind of felt like a treasure hunt. We actually found some fungal hyphae, which was really exciting. On the left, you can see the hyphae in the middle of the upper image. And so I also translated these images into files that I could cut into the SCOBY. So the original images above and then the rendered below. And so I started envisioning these as light boxes, using the dried kombucha SCOBY to layer all this information together, kind of creating a conglomerate map of these vulnerable areas. And this is my prototype box that I made. And then here are details from the finished boxes. So they used a SCOBY that was grown with the water from the Gila, and then they're layered with all these images documenting the vulnerability of these areas and kind of suggesting the need to protect them. The SCOBY here is a symbolic protective veneer, and the cut marks reveal these networks of ecosystems and geographies that shape our worlds. And so the topographical maps are actually etched into the plexi that hold all of these together, and then the microscopic images and the maps of the reservoirs are cut into the SCOBY itself. And so another place I was really drawn to in Silver City was Boston Hill. And walking through all these former mining sites, I started looking at these sites of extraction and thinking about how we could form alternative relationships and more caring relationships with these types of industrial spaces. And for me, experiencing these pits, experiencing the mining pits after they are no longer active felt kind of eerie and unsettling. And to see the earth and the rock as that would otherwise not ever be exposed to the air, and then also viewing geology that was revealed not through like slow erosive processes, but through kind of quick and often violent methods. However, these spaces are also really beautiful, and the forms of the rocks and the colors of the sediment and the lichens and plants that are starting to kind of form on all these fragmented pieces is really striking. So it was really kind of an alluring place to be. And I spent a lot of time looking for evidence of, or traces of mining equipment in the processes that can form these canyons, and these are some of the documentation. But then I started to collect rocks from the pits. This is a small selection of my photos of me holding a rock. And the idea was to start gathering pieces of these spaces, since capturing these pits as a whole felt impossible, or it is impossible. And they're also kind of difficult to comprehend and scale. So I wanted to collect little pieces as representatives of these spaces as a whole. And I kept a record of where all the rocks were found, and all I collected 62. So there's one for about every 10 mines in Grant County. And I started to sculpt mycelium onto these collected rocks. I'm thinking here of the mycelium as enacting a gesture of care onto these broken fragments. Fungi can help with the erosion of rock and break down rock into healthier soils. And in this instance, I'm thinking about giving that ability to these discarded pieces that I've collected. The fungus is presented as an agent of care here that's capable of eroding the rock and remediating the surrounding soils. And part of this project was running a workshop with students at WNMU, which was really fun, where they could learn about using the mycelium as a sculpture material and then contribute to the rocks that are being shown in the gallery. So some of the sculpted rocks in the gallery are made by Western students. We did have some casualties, where some of them molded and got contaminated, but most of them did survive. And I view the sculpted material again as this active repair, tending to the fragments in order to envision more sustainable relationships with extractive industries. And I don't think that we could necessarily live on this planet without harming other beings or influencing other ecosystems. And it's inherent that sometimes, especially as human beings, we're taking more than we can give. And really the problem for me, and for a lot of us, lies in this unfettered extraction and the growth at all cost mindset that we're experiencing today. However, I think I'm thinking about in this work how to reframe how we might treat consumption by viewing the other than human not as a resource to exploit, but as partners in a complex ecological web. And by using these materials, I'm considering how we can cultivate more compassion and attentiveness and curiosity for things that are not human. To display the rocks in the gallery, I wanted to echo the spaces that they came from. So using steel bar, I created this interlocking scaffolding with expanded steel shells that hold the sculptures. The armature references the stepped and gridded forms that are common in mining and construction sites. And I also used a patina to rust and weather the metal. You'll also notice some neon green fixtures on the wall and holding the bars in place. And they're referencing this neon color often used in construction. And that also contrasts the natural forms of the colors of the mycelium and the rocks. Throughout my work and with this space in particular, the mycelium has become a methodology rather than just a material. By fostering relationships with living organisms like the mycelium or the kombucha scoby, I begin to start to push and think outside of my humanness. I begin to understand and expand my understanding of knowledge, intelligence, and ways of being in the world. And my creative practice is really rooted in material exploration, and I use living materials throughout my practice as guides to push me into new formal and conceptual directions. There's a lot of failure in this work, but it also results in a lot of surprising and exciting work. And as I've continued to work with mycelium over the past few years, I'm really interested in how I can bridge my drawing and sculpture practice by using mycelium as a drawing material in itself. I started experimenting with growing the reishi through paper, and again, I've said this before, but the reishi is a wood-loving mushroom, so it will consume any wood-based product, including paper. And And as the mycelium grows on one side, it slowly starts to emerge on the other, leaving a trace or an echo through the paper. And based on where I put the mycelium on one side, the mushrooms would create a drawing in response on the other. So I began to test these drawings by placing mycelium over my own marks, screen printed photos, and Xerox transfers to see how the mycelium might interact, distort, or otherwise change the imagery already on the paper. Here are two of my first initial tests of this process. And you can see how the mycelium not only starts to eat away at the image, but also distorts the paper into this more sculptural form. And so I started to envision these as both kind of 2D, 3D, and as things that hang in space. And so I started to develop large-scale hanging panels for the exhibition. For this work, I was pulling from my archive of imagery that I've taken around Silver City, but I was specifically looking at traces of human impact in the environment. So on the left here, you can see a gate hinge being consumed by a tree. And then on the right, there are various images of plants kind of growing up and through against chain link fences. And these are both double-sided panels, so you're only seeing one side of each of these panels here in progress. And then I was thinking about kind of what I was going to draw with the mycelium and thinking about kind of creating this interconnected image that reflected the webbing of the mycelial process and mapping. And I wanted to create something that is kind of flexible enough to be distorted but still feels like a connected whole. So here's the process of making these drawings. I'm putting the mycelium mixed into a substrate directly onto the paper and kind of making a low relief drawing. And then I'm covering them in plastic and I'm letting them grow for about 2 or 3 weeks. The longer the better, really. And then on the right is when I revealed these drawings to let them dry for the exhibition. So the white is the mycelium fully colonizing the substrate. And so as the mycelium grew, it began to decompose the paper and the images on it. The paper starts off perfectly rectangular, but over time it starts to twist and buckle and bend as the mushrooms kind of push and pull their way through it. And then again, as the paper and the fungi dry after the first growth process. These pieces include images of human traces, and throughout this process, I'm allowing the mycelium to start to reclaim them. I'm interested here in investigating these illusionary boundaries that would establish between the built and the natural worlds, and reveal a more intertwined relationship between humans and nature. As materials and active collaborators, the bacterial and fungal networks that I'm working with throughout this exhibition guide me towards being more hopeful and connected. My non-human collaborators inspire me to be more attentive, curious, and excited during kind of perilous and tumultuous times. So as I mentioned before, the title of the exhibition, Ground Truthing, is from an essay by Barry Lopez. So I want to read quickly just part of this quote. He writes, "Change is coming fast, though, on multiple fronts. Most of us begin the day now uncertain of exactly where we are. Once we banked on knowing how to respond to all the important questions. Once we assumed we'd be able to pass on to the next generation the skill of staying poised in worrying times. To survive what's headed our way and to endure, we will have to stretch our imaginations. We will need to trust each other because today it's as if every safe place has melted into the sameness of water. We are searching for the boats we forgot to build." And this is kind of a depressing quote, but I do find that there's some hope in it. But it's really through this perspective that I'm approaching my work here that I've done in Silver City. The work in the exhibition asks questions about how we can stretch our imaginations within the geographies that we live in. And it also asks about what the land has and does teach us about where we are, where we have been, and where we can move forward. For me, I'm not necessarily interested in answers, but instead I'm asking many, many questions. to suggest that we might reframe the way that we think about knowledge and community building that includes the more than human world and provides a way to move through the grief and anger of climate change with hope to imagine brighter futures. And I just want to thank all the students and faculty at WNMU who have made this experience so wonderful. And thank you so much to Jill, who helped me with the install, and to Gilbert, Andrew, Renee, and Alice for your help installing this exhibition. And thank you so much to Gabe, who helped me so much with the fabrication for the work in the show. And thank you all for being here.
So I think right now we have time for a few questions. I'll bring the microphone back downstairs. Who has a question? Anybody? Nobody has a question? Ah, there's somebody. Okay.
Hi, thank you for this creativity. I'm wondering how you collect the mycelium.
Oh, yeah, I didn't get too much into that because it's rather complicated. But I purchased a grain spawn from a mushroom company, and then I propagate that out into a substrate that I'm kind of creating on my own. I'm purchasing reishi right now from North Store, which is a pretty large mushroom manufacturer. But yeah, it's kind of, there's multiple ways of doing it, but that's what I'm doing right now.
Any other questions? Nope. Are you sure? Okay. All right. Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and thank you, Claire, for sharing how you do all this stuff, because it's so interesting. And you'll really enjoy the show. It's very different, and we hope to see you down there. When you do come, please sign in. It helps us moving forward with our budget and everything to see how many people we get and everything like that. So do please sign in. And also, just enjoy. And if you have any questions, Claire will be there to answer them too. So thank you for coming.